Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Ikigai Leadership. My name is Drew B. Harlow, and I'm here. Special guest, Mario Sikora. Mario, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Drew. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Mario is a fellow coach, but he's also using a tool that I've learned more about in the last years. I still don't know anywhere near the depth of knowledge that Mario has, called the Enneagram. And a lot of people have been talking about this in the last couple of years. And I wanted to take the chance to talk to Mario about it. He's been using it for 30 years now, which is
Yeah, I'm an old guy, Drew. I'm an old guy.
oh man, tell us more about the Enneagram. What is it for folks who don't know?
Yeah, so the Enneagram is a model of personality styles, okay? And the word itself is Greek. It's a kind of a made up word. Ennea means nine, gram means drawing. So the Enneagram technically is a diagram with 9 points on it, 9 lines. It's a circle with 9 points on it. There's 9 lines connecting each of the points in kind of an odd geometric pattern. Um, it was used originally, it was kind of used in some esoteric philosophical traditions about 100 years ago. And about 50 years ago, a guy named Oscar Chazos from originally from Bolivia, but living in Chile at the time, started mapping personality characteristics to it. So it's, when people talk about the Enneagram, they're really talking about a personality model with 9 basic personality types. And it's something that, again, when I first was introduced to it 30 years ago, was something that really not many people knew anything about. And now I tend to run into it everywhere, right? See it on TV, see it, there's a paint company, I think it's Sherwin-Williams, even has an Enneagram-inspired paint palette, right?
Really?
So if you're a particular type, you should like these colors. And I saw something in Brides magazine the other day on what Enneagram type you should marry based on your type and so forth. So it's gotten out into the popular culture these days.
Yeah, and I talked briefly about this, but there's a light side and a dark side to that, right? In
Yeah.
terms of popularity and becoming more mainstream, I think
Yeah.
the danger of that is real. And you wanted to share a little bit about that. Tell us more about what the good and the bad of that is.
Yeah, sure. So one of the, we live in the information age where we have access to all the information in the world practically in our pockets, and 95% of it is wrong, right? So, we don't have the gatekeepers in society, intellectually, that we used to back, prior to the internet. And again, in ways that's good, in other ways it's not so good.
Yeah.
When it comes to the Enneagram, back 30 years ago, there were, a handful of books, and there were a handful of people that had been studying it for a long time and teaching it. And you had to kind of go through training programs and all this stuff to learn about it. Now, all you need is an internet connection, okay, or a cell phone, and you can go on Instagram. And, I forget last time I looked, but there are literally millions of, hits on Google for the Enneagram. And again, the downside is that people can read a book, or watch a video, or follow an Instagram person and start talking about the Enneagram without having any real depth of experience in it or understanding the nuances of the model. And this is one of the the beauties of the Enneagram, and one of the reasons I started using it in my work 30 years ago is because, number one, it was a really powerful tool, right? I was familiar with Myers-Briggs, I was familiar with DISC, with some of the other models. But the Enneagram gave me a richness of experience and a depth of understanding of myself and the people that I was working with that I hadn't encountered anywhere else, right? And so there was a real power to that. And so what ends up happening is that at first, because it's so powerful, people start to think it's easy, right? You start to say,
Mm.
oh, well, this person is clearly that type, or that person is clearly that type. And then confirmation bias kicks in, and you start to see the characteristics of that type in the person, or the person says, oh, yeah, that's me, right? In psychology, there's what's called the Forer effect, where the Barnum effect, where, you read a description, and if it's general enough, you'll say, oh, yeah, that's me, until you
Yep.
realize that everybody got that description, and, everybody's saying, oh, yeah, that's me, right? So, but once you really start to understand the Enneagram, it's actually a fairly nuanced and subtle model, which makes it even better, right? Because you start
Mhm.
to realize, hey, wait a minute, this is really, there's really something to this, because it's more complicated, or more complex, or more sophisticated than people initially realized.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that that effect. I forgot the name of it now
The
that you mentioned
Forer
the
effect.
Forer effect. Yeah, because
Yeah.
I think psychics use that a lot of times, right?
Yes.
These psychics,
Yes.
to fool people like, oh, is there someone here with the letter E in their name? It's
Yes.
like E happens to be the most common letter in the alphabet, so like, it's going to be chances are someone in the audience is
Right.
going to have a letter E.
Yeah. Right.
Um, but no, I like that you distinguished it also from the Myers-Briggs, because I had this discussion with a couple friends a couple years ago about the Myers-Briggs, and they're really big on the Myers-Briggs, right? These
Right.
two girls that I knew, and they were really big on it, and they're like, oh,
Mhm.
MBTI. I'm like, yeah, it's great, that's awesome. It's great as a model to start from,
Sure.
but you can't limit people to that box,
Yes.
right? Because you
Yes.
take the Myers-Briggs on a good day, and then you take the Myers-Briggs when you're having a shitty day,
Yes.
and those are going to be two very different results, or can be,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. Yes. And I've taken the Myers-Briggs assessment a number of times over the years, and I fluctuate, right?
Yeah.
Depending on a few things. So, it's funny. I have a LinkedIn newsletter that I send out every week, and I'm the one I'm sending out this week is on, why I use a personality model, right? Rather than
Mhm.
not use one, because there are dangers. We can put people into boxes. We can make assumptions about people. We can see them in a limited way, right? I've heard people
Yeah.
say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't hire this person for that job because they're a type 7 or whatever," right? And that's just not my experience of how this works. But what we have to realize is that all of these things are just models, right?
Yeah.
They're heuristics, they're frameworks. And there's a great quote by a statistician named George Box, I think, who said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Okay. And so what we have to
Love that.
realize with these models is that, yeah, they point us to something, but that's not the whole story by any stretch, right? And I always tell people, according to the Enneagram, there are 9 basic kinds of people.
Mhm.
You branch that out to sort of 27 variations that somebody can come back to. But even if you think 27 kinds of people in the world, you're putting 8 billion people into those 27 buckets. You're going to get a whole lot of variation. Okay.
Yeah.
But you're also going to see, take the Myers-Briggs, right? Some people are introverted and some people are extroverted. Okay. And that's helpful to know.
Mhm.
Nobody is purely introverted. Nobody is purely extroverted, but it helps to remember that there are tendencies that people
Right.
fall into so that we can stop expecting everybody to be like us.
Yep.
Right. And then being frustrated when they're not.
And I like that tendency. I use that term a lot with my clients, as a tendency, right? They have a tendency
Yes.
towards this behavior, towards
Yes.
this belief, or that kind of thing. And with the Enneagram, I found, at least folks I've talked to, other folks I've talked to,
Yeah.
have mentioned something around the spiritual side of it, almost like where it's like a deeper meaning behind it. Do you
Right.
mind talking a little more about that?
Sure. So just by way of background, in my early days, out of high school, I went to seminary for a couple of years, and my education is in philosophy and literature, and so I have an appreciation for spirituality and religion and these sort of things, but I take a very secular approach to this. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, the Enneagram did grow out of a sort of psycho spiritual tradition. And in recent years, it's really taken off in churches, particularly the evangelical churches of
Oh,
Christianity. And that has been behind a lot of the spread of the Enneagram is through people learning about it in churches and people teaching it in churches. And I always say, if there's one thing that the evangelicals are good at, it's evangelizing, and they've done it with the Enneagram too, right? So,
yep.
so it's often tied with spirituality, but I am very careful to divorce it from that for a couple of reasons. Okay, number one,
Mhm.
I think that you can take anything and put it into something bigger. Okay, so
Yep.
you can take a model of personality and put it into a spiritual tradition, and that's fine, but it doesn't mean that it has to be within that context. Okay,
Sure.
the other thing is, because I work in organizations, I'm really careful about staying away from topics related to religion or spirituality from an HR compliance perspective, from a legal perspective, and just from a respect perspective. Okay. I don't know what
Yeah.
your spiritual traditions are, and I'm certainly not going to try to impose any that I have onto you. For me, the Enneagram is simply a model from my approach to it. My approach is a bit distinct, but it's not something esoteric. It's not something that exists outside of a map or a construct that people came up with. It's just a model that says, you know what? There are 2 basic dimensions of personality that this model looks at. Okay. Number one is what we call the three instinctual biases. And this is a tendency to pay attention to one of three domains of life needs. Okay. And the other is the nine strategies, which is where the Ennea comes from. And
Mhm.
this is just a habitual pattern of a tendency to want to feel a certain way, to start to think a certain way in order to feel that way, and then a tendency to behave in fairly consistent ways because there's a logical sense to those behaviors. Okay. If I'll give an example of that, if you
Mhm.
don't mind.
Yeah, please.
So, one of the strategies, what we call a preferred strategy or my Enneagram type is the type 8, which I call striving to feel powerful. Okay. So this is somebody who likes to be in charge, wants to, drive things, can be, overly self confident at times and so forth. Right. But they're also, often good leaders and so forth. Um, there's something in my psyche that wants to feel powerful, right? It's just, without having to think about it, I just, I feel good when I feel powerful.
Mhm.
Well, so what am I going to think about? I'm going to think about things that reinforce that feeling of being powerful. Okay. So I develop a particular mindset, and then that's going to shape my behaviors. Okay. Um, and I'm going to act in ways that, help me feel powerful or demonstrate power. Now, I'm not doing that all the time, right? I'm not
Right.
doing that when I'm sitting watching Netflix with my wife or when I'm hanging out with my kids or, petting my cats or anything like that, right? I'm just a guy doing what people do. Okay. But when I start to feel stress, when I start to feel a need to, address something in the world to solve some problem, that pattern will probably, feel right for me. And it's probably the one I'll use.
Mhm.
Okay. And again, I always say nobody does anything all the time, and
Right.
everybody does some things some of the time. Okay.
Right.
We're just talking about a tendency here. I use that strategy more than I use the other eight. And that's why we call me a type 8.
I like that, and that's a great framing. It reminds me of the rubber band
Mm,
mentality kind of thing, right? It's like
mm,
when you're stretched out,
yes.
you can stretch a rubber band to any shape you want to stretch it out to, right?
Yes.
But when you let it go and it goes back, it's going to go back to that
Yes.
same general shape, right? It may not
Yes.
be exactly the same shape, but it's going to have the same general shape that's in,
Yes.
right? So its
Yes.
tendency is to be in that shape. And so it sounds like it's something similar with your Enneagram type, so to speak,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And to get back to your early question for just a moment, from
Mhm.
a philosophical perspective, there's a difference between what's called ontology and then, nominalism, right? So
Mhm.
ontology is what is this thing, right? What is the essence of this thing? Versus a nominalist approach is, well, here's what we call something that has this group of characteristics. Okay.
Mhm.
I don't see the Enneagram as an ontological model. Okay, we can take for example, citizenship as an
Mhm.
ontological argument. Okay, so I'm a U.S. citizen. You are too. Okay, I was
Yep.
born here. It's on my passport. Boom, it's what I am. Okay,
Yep.
but y- you know, there are other things that are not, fact based that way. And so the way I think of the Enneagram is it's a tendency to favor certain things and that tendency has developed over a whole lifetime of repetition and habit forming and so forth. And maybe I was born that way, maybe not. Nobody really knows. Okay. It's just, we know that it's there. And you're right. So now hopefully I will grow, right? I always like to joke that my wife and I have been married for 23 years now, going on 23 years, and I rarely surprise her. Okay. And what I mean by that is that my dysfunction is still pretty much what it was when we first started dating, right? The things that she gets frustrated with me about are pretty much the same. I don't come home with new dysfunction or new quirks or anything like that. Now, I do them less.
Mhm.
Okay. I do them less intensely. I do them less frequently. But to your point about the rubber band, it's probably going to be the same handful of things that we irritate each other about or that we fall into, over and over again. And I know you're recently married, so this is a word of advice. 20 years from now, you'll be, saying, yeah, you know what, I still do the same dumb things I did 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, and it is definitely good advice, and I appreciate it, and I think also, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about the fact that like we are, we are who we are, right? And
Sure.
and there's
Right.
that tendency to consistently be there, be that person, right? And
Yeah.
and your way of being is driven by what you believe, right? And what you
Mhm.
fear, and all those different core values. And it sounds like that's what this kind of measures a little bit in some ways, right? It's kind of like what's at your core in terms of what drives you. And even
Yeah.
if that behavior might manifest a little bit differently, it might be hard to surprise someone after 23 years in terms of
Right,
like,
right, right. And there's nothing wrong with being who you are, right?
right,
We tend to forget that, the brain, the mind comes from the brain, okay?
right,
And the brain is a physical mechanism, and so, the tendency to repeat behaviors and repeat actions creates physical substance in the brain, right? Myelination around synaptic connections and so forth that reinforce our tendencies to act a similar way in the future because it
right.
has been, shown to be effective. And now I can do it more quickly than I did before, meaning I have to use less caloric energy to do it. So, and most of the time that's just fine, right? There's nothing wrong with me being who I am, except when I do something dysfunctional and cause problems. Okay. And so what we have to do is realize that it's fine to have a personality. And in fact, we need people who are different. Right. We
Yeah,
need people who are each of these types. And in organizations, you don't expect your finance people to be just as good at sales as they are at finance, right? Or just as good
right.
at engineering as they are at sales. No, we get, things work better when you have different kinds of people. So the goal with the Enneagram is not to try and become some, non-identifiable, non-personality sort of character. It's to recognize what our preferred strategy is, to recognize the ways we use it adaptively, meaning it helps us be effective, it reduces our suffering, it helps us reduce the suffering of other people, and how we can use it maladaptively at times, right? Which means
Hmm.
that the opposite of all those things, and we cause more trouble. And then we want to just work on how do I start using it more adaptively and more flexibly rather than maladaptively. That's
Yeah,
the work.
yeah. No, and that's a great way to look at it too, because it is a journey, right? It's
Sure.
consistently trying to, reinforce good behaviors and,
Yes.
adapt to bad behaviors. But to your point, as we evolve as humans, what works for us to a certain point doesn't work for us after that point, right? It might
Right.
get us to a certain point,
Right.
and then after
Right.
that, we have to create new behaviors and new things
Yes.
and understand different things.
Yes.
When you're thinking about the Enneagram, how have you seen clients change over the years, or if you've seen that kind of a
Yeah.
shift in people? Do people move between numbers, or what does that look like?
Yeah. So, it's funny. There's discussion of this, and so kind of the standard response related to the Enneagram is, oh, people don't change their Enneagram type, right? You don't go from being a type 8 to a type 3, for example, and so forth. Um, what happens is, and what I try to accomplish with my clients
Mhm,
is to help them develop flexibility of response. Okay. So here's the way we think about it. So our preferred strategy. Okay. So let's say it's somebody who's a type 3, which is what we call striving to feel outstanding, right? So this is
mhm,
kind of a Tom Cruise, sort of character, wants to achieve things and accomplish things. And it's a great thing to be, especially in organizations. Um, Folks like that can be really successful because they're driven, they're accomplished, they're hardworking, all of that. And then they can start to struggle because they reach a certain point and they say, you know what? I'm doing everything myself. I've got too many things on my plate. I can't scale because I don't hand things over to people and delegate and develop people and so forth. Right. And so they have to start to learn these skills. Now, I'm not trying to get them to, okay, stop being a type 3. You want to start being this type instead, because that's just not going to happen, right? It's
right,
just, but what we can start to say is, okay, how does your strategy of striving to feel outstanding create inner narratives for you that keep you from changing? Right.
right,
So, if, for example, my inner narrative says striving to feel outstanding means doing a really great job and being recognized for it and doing things faster and better than everybody else, okay, that's good up to a certain point. But now, if you get into a leadership role, your job is to get performance through other people, not through yourself.
right,
So, the switch I'll make with somebody like that is, okay, what is the difference between being an outstanding doer and an outstanding leader? Okay.
Hmm.
So you're still leveraging this need to be outstanding that they have, but now you're kind of giving it a different perspective. And they start to realize, oh, wait a minute, an outstanding leader does different things than an outstanding doer. And I
Right.
want to be outstanding. So I'll start doing those things. Okay. If you try to get them to reject their type or be another type or something, they're going to resist the change, right? If you tell a three, stop being outstanding, right? They're going to say, whoa, what are we talking about here, right? Why would I do that? Okay. But you give them a different way to do it. And now what happens is as they start to rewrite these narratives, they start to develop more flexibility. Oh, wait a minute. I can be more outstanding by helping other people grow. I
Hmm.
can be more outstanding by stepping into the background and becoming, an advisor or something like that, right? So you start to get some looseness. And what that means is that you can start exhibiting other behaviors that might have been more difficult for you in the past once you start to rewrite that strategy.
Yeah. So we're kind of redefining how they define
Yes,
what that type looks like for them.
exactly right.
Right.
Exactly right.
Yeah. That's powerful, man. I love that.
Yeah.
And how is your journey taking you through this process so far? So I mean, where you are right now is obviously not where you started 30 years ago, right?
Yeah, right.
What's that journey looked like for you?
Yeah.
What were the twists and turns you went along the way to get to where you're
Yeah.
at now?
So, I like to say I sort of Forrest Gumped my way into, the work that I do. And, I started off I mentioned, being in seminary early on, and I realized, okay, that wasn't for me. And then I ended up in publishing and was doing corporate communications work. And I really liked that because part of the corporate communications work, I was doing training workshops for the company I was working with. And I enjoyed that. And so I had the opportunity let's see, this would be 1997 to join a little consulting group. It was just a couple of guys and they were doing team building and coaching. And I was with them for about a year. And again, I really enjoyed it. I liked there was always a part of me that liked to teach. There was always a part of me that liked to help people grow and improve. And I had been studying the Enneagram for a few years at that point, and I realized, man, the Enneagram is just a really powerful tool for the kind of work that we're doing. But they were kind of wedded to a different model of personality styles. And so I decided to go out on my own. Now, as you pointed out, the Enneagram has its roots in some more psycho-spiritual traditions. So when I started taking the literature of the time into organizations, it wasn't ideal, right? And I started to seeing some of the ideas didn't really hold up. They weren't that strong in that environment. So I wanted a book that I could give to my clients, and it didn't exist. So I wrote one, right? With a co-author, right? And so
Yeah.
as we were writing that book, I started to really rethink some things about the Enneagram, right? Number one, for example, at the time, there was no real kind of fundamental descriptor of what it meant to be a particular type. Like, so for example, myself as a type eight, would say, well, eights are kind of like this, and they're kind of like that, and they're this way and they're that way. But there wasn't this, okay, what is that one thing? Okay. And so that's where I came up with these strategies, right? So somebody who's an eight is somebody who's striving to feel powerful.
Mhm.
That's the kind of starting point that everything else sort of stems from. So I started to develop kind of a new way of talking about the Enneagram. And I was always a writer. Again, my background was in corporate communications. So I started writing articles about the Enneagram. That started getting me noticed in the Enneagram world, which is, it's kind of a weird thing to say that there's an Enneagram world, but there's more people out there than you would think.
Yeah.
And so I started getting invited to speak at conferences. There are, Enneagram conferences all over the world. And people started saying, hey, teach us the way you do this. Okay. So in addition to working with my clients, we do a certification program and training programs to teach other people how to use the Enneagram the way that we do. And it was really I was really fortunate because in addition to as I started writing more, I started getting asked to travel, to go to different countries to do Enneagram workshops. And I've taught the Enneagram probably in over 20 countries. My clients also, tended to be multinational organizations. So I would travel to do, work overseas with my clients and again, do Enneagram workshops. Um, and I think the growth for me or the path for me has been a real appreciation of the nuances and subtleties, but also shared humanity of
Mm.
people, right? I've taught the Enneagram, for example, in Korea. I've taught it in South America. I've taught it in, all over Europe. I've taught it in the Middle East. And even though those people are very different, right? I mean, I know you spent a lot of time in Japan, for example, right? And
Yep.
so you go to Japan, and I've only been there a very short time, but people are really different, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Japanese culture is really, really different from US culture, but you still see these Enneagram types, right?
Mm.
Which is fascinating to me, right? It's fascinating to me that I can spend, people in Korea want to spend 3 days listening to me talk about the Enneagram because it applies to them, right? When everything else, from my view, just feels so different and so foreign. So
Yeah.
it's been a real opportunity to recognize, and how many other ways too we share humanity. Obviously, the Enneagram's not the only way, right? But it's so easy to get caught up in differences. It's so easy to get caught up in tribalism. Okay,
Mm.
especially today when we're separated because we're all working from home and we're all in our information, ecosystems and so forth. But it's, there's so much there that pulls us together
Yeah.
that I think is easy to lose sight of.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I was having this discussion with someone earlier today about about similar things, like specifically about DEI
Hmm.
specifically,
Hmm.
and the concept and why it's so rejected nowadays. It's becoming very
Yeah.
rejected, that
Yes.
concept. And I think part of it is that it is that piece. It focuses on, well, what it's become is, and not what it should be. What true DEI work is facilitating conversations and teaching
Yes.
people how to have
Yes.
conversations and healthy disagreements,
Yes.
right? And me understanding your perspective, and that your perspective doesn't have to be my perspective, and we
Correct.
can still be good humans by having different perspectives and
Yes.
different experiences, right?
Yeah.
When you're thinking about the Enneagram and how that it might apply in there, I mean, I know maybe it doesn't. I have no, I'm
Mm.
not sure, but where kind of what I guess the question I'm asking is like, what, where might the Enneagram be able to lend some value in that space of
Yeah.
acknowledging differences and also
Yeah.
acknowledging similarities, if at all? I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah. No, it's a great question, and I always like to caveat anything on this when it comes to discussions of diversity. That I'm the poster boy of people who shouldn't be talking about diversity, right?
But see, even that concept, though, right? That concept of
Right?
who should and shouldn't be talking about it
Yes,
is also a miscommunication or
yes,
misidentification, right?
yes,
Because it's that's the whole that's antithesis of that concept of like anyone can talk about the common human
yes,
understanding, because that's really what diversity, equity, inclusion is about. It's about
yes.
including people, not excluding people, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right, and thank you for pointing that out because the reason I tend to avoid discussing it is because my perspective is often rejected just because I'm a middle-aged, white guy, right? So,
Right.
now that said, but again, I think also that when somebody's talking about, say, for example, racial or gender diversity, you need to have some expertise in the area, okay? And that's not an
100%.
area in which I have expertise in, right? So I'm
Fair
not
enough.
going to pontificate about those sort of things. But
Sure.
what the Enneagram does tell us is that people are different, okay? And different does not mean bad.
Right.
And so, for example, my wife is a different personality style than I am, and we have 4 boys, and they have different personality styles. And I can fall into thinking, why do you say those things? Why do you do those things? Why do you act those way? They don't make any sense. But to them, they do.
Hmm.
And they're perfectly valid from their perspective and for what their needs are and for what their goals are. Right. And so instead of me saying, oh, wait a minute, you need to be more like me, I can step back and say, well, he's just doing what is important to him and he's approaching something a different way. And that is fine. Okay, as long as we can find some common ground on which to operate. And so when I go into an organization and work with people, that's kind of the big message, right? Number one, I'm working with individuals to help them improve, but I'm also working with teams to say, okay, here's why Drew talks this way sometimes or thinks this way, or here's why Drew might focus on this area rather than something else. It's coming from, amongst other things, his personality style. Okay.
Hmm.
And that is fine. And so if I want to collaborate with Drew, communicate with him, I can't keep speaking in my language, right?
Right.
And to my values and my priorities. I have to understand who you are, what's important to you, what you value, what you want to achieve, and then speak a language that resonates with you. And that way we can find collaboration. But I can't expect you to become me or like me, nor should I, because that would be a loss for both of us.
Yeah. And I think that that's important language you used, which is that concept of using your language versus my language, right? Even
Yes.
though we're speaking the same English language,
Yes.
right? We still have our own common understandings
Yes.
of common words, but we also have our own understandings in our heads of
Yeah.
what certain words mean to us in our experiences.
Right.
And I think people tend to think in the context of, oh, we're speaking the same language, so we should understand each other, and you should understand exactly what I mean when I say X, or
Right.
and it's just not true,
Right.
And so I think I appreciate that, definitely. And
Yeah.
switching gears for a second before,
Sure.
you brought up something that I think I think is interesting. I don't know if other people will think it's interesting, but how you and your wife are different types, right?
Yes.
And your kids are also different types.
Yes.
In terms of trends or anything like that, have you found that two different types can produce different, like, is it like genetic thing where you like, oh, we have an 8 and a 5 produce like 3, 4, and 6, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
is there any kind of correlation between parents and their kids in terms of what types they are?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. So, I have not seen a formula that holds up that way, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I haven't seen anything that correlates to birth order. I haven't seen anything that correlates to, you should marry this type, if you're that type, sort of thing, right? So, nobody really knows what causes an Enneagram type, right?
Mhm.
We don't know if it's genetic. We don't think if it's something developed. I think it's something there pretty early, right? As the father of four, you start to realize, man, kids are really baked in. There's a whole lot about their personality that's there from the beginning, right? And
Yeah.
and a woman who's had more than one child will say, man, they were different in utero, right? Some were really
Mm.
active, some not, and so forth. So, so we don't really know what causes this or what leads to it. And for me, the key thing is to recognize it, and and to realize, oh, okay, that's where it's coming from, so I'm going to be more patient. Now, what I will say when it comes to relationships, the Enneagram is a great tool for helping to improve our relationships. Okay.
Mhm.
Because again, it makes us to say, okay, this is why this is important to her. My wife, for example, is an Enneagram type 7, which we call striving to feel excited. And when you think of the 7, you think of somebody who's optimistic and upbeat and always looks at the positive. And that's how she is. I mean, not all the time. Nobody's anyway all the time, of course.
Sure.
But, she's a delightful, charming person, whereas I'm an angry curmudgeon and, intimidating to people and all that sort of thing. And so I love those things about her. And sometimes I become a little frustrated by her tendency to, always see the positive things. And, but again, recognizing, okay, yeah, well, she's a 7, and so she's doing that. But this other piece of it that I mentioned earlier, these 3 instinctual biases are really, really important when it comes to relationships, not just spousal relationships or parenting relationships, but work relationships. And I have actually found that to be even more useful than the
Mhm.
9 Enneagram types, right? So, and if you don't mind, I'll explain those
Yeah,
3.
please.
Yeah, yeah. So the 3 instinctual biases are tendencies to pay attention to particular areas of life. And the way I always like to explain it is that imagine watching a documentary about peacocks on television. Okay.
Mhm.
And so the first part of the documentary is about what we would call the preserving domain, which is all about nesting and nurturing, right? How's the peacock make their nest? How do they, find food? How do they groom themselves? How do they take care of their physical well-being, stay safe from predators, take care of their offspring, all of these things.
Mhm.
The second part of the documentary is about what we would call the navigating domain. And this is all about how does the peacock orient to the rest of the flock, right? How does it track the group and social dynamics? How does it figure out what its place in the pecking order is and all of these sort of things? And then we have what's called the transmitting domain. And that's all about how the peacock gets the attention of the peahen so they can make little pea babies, right? So this is
Mhm.
all about attracting and bonding, right? Now, Humans are more complicated than peacocks, right? If you've ever seen a peacock, they got these tiny little brains inside these tiny little heads. But humans aren't that much more complicated than peacocks. Okay. We
Right.
care about those same three things, right? Preserving, navigating, and transmitting, just
Yeah.
in more complex ways. And each of us has a bias towards one of these areas, meaning we pay more attention to it. So, my wife, in addition to being an Enneagram type 7, is what we would call a preserving 7, meaning that her focus of attention is in the preserving domain. So, it's all about nesting and nurturing. It's all about physical comfort and well being, and all about being safe and secure. And whereas my bias is towards the navigating domain, which
Mhm.
is all about people. How does the group work, right? What are the social interactions, all that sort of thing. So when she starts talking about the preserving stuff, there's a part of my brain that just kind of goes elsewhere, right? It's like that Homer Simpson clanging, monkey clanging the cymbals, right, in his
Yep.
head. And so, and I keep thinking, why is she talking about these things? Who cares, right? It doesn't matter, and so forth. But to her, it's really, really important.
Mhm.
And if I want to, now, if I were smarter and if I step back, I say, you know what, these things are kind of important and I actually need to pay more attention to them. But I also have to give her the space to focus on what's important to her and realize that in the same way that what's important to me is important to me, the things that are important to her are important to her. Okay.
Yeah.
So, so really, in my view, the key to using the Enneagram for having a better relationship or being a better parent or being a better coworker is to realize that number one, there are these three biases that shape what we think is important in life. Okay. And our attention will go there. And then there are these 9 strategies which shape how we will do it, right? What our style is. And if we can keep those things in mind, we step back, we say, all right, she's doing her thing. I'm doing my thing. We find a way to, speak each other's language when we need to, and we tolerate each other when we don't need to. I mean, speak the same language, that is.
Yeah. No, that's super fascinating, and I do have a follow-up question on that, which
Yeah.
is the bias, like well, 2 questions now that I
Yeah,
was thinking
sure.
about it, but, can the person have more than one bias in those 3 areas? Can they
Yeah.
be preferential to the more than one of those 3 things?
Yeah. That's a great question. So there's a couple of things, right? So number one, um, the way I think of the bias, and again, nobody does anything all the time.
Sure.
It's a bias because we're biased towards that. We do all 3 of them, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
there's a specific way that these things play out, and has fascinated me for years. Okay, so the way I like to think about this, number one, you want to think of it as a trend line over time, right?
Mhm.
So more of my attention, more of my energy over time is going to go to the navigating domain. But there's energy going to go to the others as well.
Mhm.
And circumstances will dictate how much energy goes to those areas, right?
Right.
If I'm hungry, if I don't have enough food, if I'm not making enough money, I start becoming more preserving. Okay. If you want to see preserving in somebody, observe a woman who's 8 months pregnant, right? Whether
Mhm.
she's naturally more preserving or not. Anyway, those hormones are going to be kicking in and you're going to see huge nesting preserving behaviors. If you want to see the navigating behaviors, um, go to watch freshmen in college. Okay, they move to this place and it's like, oh man, who are all these people, right? How do I figure this out? So they're observing and so forth. And if you want to see the transmitting bias at play, go to the college bar on a Saturday night, right? You're going to see everybody doing the peacock thing, right? And
Yeah.
showing off and getting attention and so forth. So circumstances influence this. Now, the way this works that's fascinating to me is that these instinctual biases express themselves in a predictable way. And so you've got these 3 biases, and one of them is what we call a zone of enthusiasm, right? So
Mhm.
for me, it's the navigating domain. That's the water I swim in. It's where my attention goes. It's what I enjoy thinking about and doing. The second domain is what we call a zone of inner conflict, meaning that I kind of do it and I kind of don't. I kind of like it and I kind of don't. And I feel compelled to it, but I also feel awkward in it at times. And for me as a navigator and all other navigators so far that I've seen, that tends to be in the transmitting domain. So there's a part of them that likes to transmit, and there's another part of them that feels comfortable about it.
Mhm.
And the third zone is what we call a zone of indifference. And for me and other navigators, that's the preserving domain. All right, I get it. I know I know I've got to get in out of the rain, right? I know I got to make enough money to keep, pay my mortgage, all that sort of stuff. But I try not to give it any more thought than I need to. Now, here's what happens is when you understand these patterns, Casey, you know that that's the way it works for navigators. With preservers, you've got preserving is the dominant one. You've got the navigating domain as the zone of inner conflict. I like to talk to people, but only up to a certain point. I like to socialize, but only up to a certain point. And they're indifferent towards transmitting. So you have preservers in the business world who are really great at getting the work done, being methodical, being process oriented, but don't promote themselves well. Right, because of the indifference to the transmitting. And then when you take the transmitters, these are people who, they love to transmit, right? And there's part of them that's really focused on the preserving stuff. I want to go out and make money, right? But I never feel like it's enough. I really need to exercise. I'm going to go work out, but I never feel like it's quite enough. But they don't pay enough attention to the navigating domain. So they're not great at reading organizational politics, for example. So I've worked with so many people over the years who are great at promoting themselves and rising high up into the organization. But then because they don't read the navigating stuff very well, they don't read the organizational politics, and they end up getting blindsided and struggling. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you understand how these patterns play themselves out, you start to see where there are gaps in people's development. There are gaps in organizations because organizations tend to take on a culture of one of these, domains and so forth. And it becomes a really good sort of decoder for what tends to be happening in organizations.
Yeah, that's super, super fascinating. Yeah, you actually answered my other question, I think, in the process of that question, which the question was actually if there's a deficiency in others because of the one, and that you kind of answered that, which is awesome. So awesome, man. Well, I'm gonna switch gears again one more time for the last question before we end here because we're at time. But for you in your career, in your 30 plus years doing this work, who or what has been the biggest influence on you in your career and who you are right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm trying to avoid, kind of, stereotypical answers. I'm like, oh, my children have been that sort of thing. They have been a huge influence on me, obviously, but that's not what it is. I've been fortunate to have, over the course of my life, a handful of mentors who, seem to either show up at the right time or, I was just able to connect with at the right time, who gave me perspective. One of the challenges I have to admit is part of my personality style as an Enneagram type 8 is thinking I'm the boss of the world and thinking I know everything and thinking I'm in charge of everything, right? So it's always been challenging for me, or it's always been not natural, I'll say, for me to grab onto a mentor that I hold on to and that has, a huge influence on me. But I've been lucky to have some people who came in and, really provided a source of wisdom and balance. And to do that, honestly, my wife has been a huge moderator on me because she's the yin to my yang, right? I mean, I'm all id and she's all sweet and, kindness and so forth. I'm also fortunate enough to have a great business partner, a woman named Maria Jose, who, brings huge perspective to my volatility, right? And, has been really great in that. So I wish I could say that there's been one influence. I will say, again, just because I tend to talk a lot. Lately, there's a philosopher who I wish more people knew more about because he's had I've been doing a deep dive into the work of Karl Popper lately, who was a philosopher of science. But, I have just found that his way of thinking about falsification, creation of explanations as a way of understanding the world, and then attempting to falsify our perspectives and our hypotheses on things has just been had a profound influence on the way I think in general. So I've got to give a shout out to Karl Popper there.
Interesting. I haven't heard of that guy, but yeah, I'm gonna look him up now. So
I'll send you a book. So there's a book called Philosophy in the Real World. The author's name, I think, is McGee. I'm not sure, but it's a really good introduction to the work of Karl Popper. And there's also, I'm sure you're familiar with Tim Ferriss and his
Mhm.
podcast. And so he did an interview with Naval Ravikant and David Deutsch last year that I really recommend people listen to, because David Deutsch is this brilliant, brilliant scientist who's sort of an heir to Karl Popper, and they talked about his ideas there in a really good way.
Super interesting, man. Thanks so much. This whole thing was a really great conversation. I really appreciate
Great.
the
I
the
enjoyed
knowledge
it.
and looking into the Enneagram a little more. For those of you who are interested, please feel free to reach out to Mario. His information will be in the chat, and there's more information about the Enneagram as well on his website. So,
Great.
Mario, thank you again so much for taking the time to talk with us today and share your wealth of knowledge about this really fascinating assessment and tool. So,
Drew, it was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
absolutely, man. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks again, Mario.
So long.